we have so far discussed how our muscles spanning certain sides of a joint are going to contract and cause all our body movements right there, all our movements in space. So again, when we're talking about contraction, we're talking about the length of the muscle contracting, and then depending on what it's connected to, it's going to pull those two things closer together. And just to backtrack, the thing getting pulled closer to the more stable thing is your insertion point, and this is your origin point, right? But you're pulling two things together basically when those muscles contract. What we're going to talk about here is a bigger kind of picture within the muscles, how the muscles are arranged to actually transmit the force of contraction from a muscle cell over to the bone right here. And that'll all have to do with these successive connective tissue layers that are organizing the muscle fibers into a muscle, right? So when you're looking at any particular, especially these cadavers or model images right here, you're going to see all these lines, right? These strips of meat right here, right? That are all kind of going in a particular direction, right? They have an organization and there's a pattern to them. All these visible strips that you can see going from the origin to the insertion right here, right? You could also see these, right, in this flank steak right here, right? You can see these lines right over here. I was eating this the other day because a friend of mine suggested I try raw food, and I could tell you that when you try this, it's very chewy, very hard to eat right there. And I think it's because all this connective tissue in here is full of collagen, and until you cook meat, then it starts breaking down. That's when it starts getting nice and tender, right? So don't believe this raw eating stuff. All right, here's another example of these fascicles right here, right? This is a human, gluteus maximus right here. And you can see those same kind of strips, these arrangements right here, right? This is all part of muscle organization. And what you're looking at right here is something called the fascicles within the muscle, right? So these are the visible strips that you see. So when you're looking at that, what you're looking at is one of these things right here, right? And what one of these things is a fascicle, and it's created by this layer of connective tissue. And a bunch of those fascicles within a muscle is going to create the muscle, and the muscle itself is going to be surrounded by connective tissue. This fascicle itself is created by a bunch of muscle fibers all bundled together by a certain type of connective tissue around each muscle cell, right? So this is all about these sort of successive layers, sequential layers of connective tissue forming these distinct units to make up the whole muscle right here. And what their function is, right? How many different roles they serve in both supporting the muscle as well as in part of their functional role. So the general picture of organization here, right? When we looked at the skin, when we looked at all the layers of your skin and stuff like that and the tubes, right? It had those layers. In this case, it's going to kind of look like a tube within a tube within a tube right here. So this is the sort of general plan we have of the structural organizations. Tubes within a tube within a tube, right? So your muscle is one big tube composed of a bunch of fascicles, which can be composed of a bunch of cells. So here, right here is a muscle. That's the organ itself. This would be, say, your biceps brachii right here, right? Covered by a layer of connective tissue. And then within it, you have these other little tubes. These are the fascicles. This is what you were looking at when you saw those lines visible on the meat. Right? So these are fascicles, and they're made up of a bunch of muscle fibers. Right? So in this unit, when I say fibers, I mean muscle cells. Right? In the last unit, I talked about collagen and elastic fibers. Those were protein filaments. These, when I say fibers, are cells. So basically, fiber means anything really long and stringy. When we get to the nervous system, a fiber will mean a part of a cell, right? The axon. But that's just for when I say fiber in this context, it's just referring to the muscle cell itself, because these muscle cells are super, super long, like a piece of hair or something. So they look like a fiber. So that's the arrangement, though. The fibers are within fascicles. The fascicles are within muscle. And each one of these levels is going to be surrounded by a particular layer of named connective tissue. Right? So the name of these are all mesium something. Mesium means muscle. So if you see mesium for anything, mesium means mice. When people first looked at like muscles as you were contracting your biceps, they thought it looked like a little mouse going under a rug. So muscle actually means mouse. Mesium means mouse. So epimesium is the surrounding around the muscle. Perimesium is the connective tissue surrounding the fascicles, really making up the fascicle. And then around each muscle fiber is an endomesium. Right, so epi, peri, and endomesium. Those are the connective tissue layers. So here they are again, right? And this is scaled up a little bit. Here's the actual, a little more to scale right here. But you got the organ, right, which is going to be covered by epimesium. This is all, you can just consider any of these connective tissue layers, fibrous connective tissue. It's dense, irregular, or loose connective tissue. Don't worry about that. It's just fibrous connective tissue, right? The name of it is epimesium, making up, wrapping around the whole muscle, wrapping around a bunch of fascicles. And each fascicle is going to be surrounded by perimesium over here. And that perimesium, or the fascicle rather, is going to be composed of a bunch of muscle fibers. That is the cell, which is in turn going to be covered by this endomesium. Right? So these are the connective tissue wrappings. So if I ask you what layer this is, you'll say endomesium because you're going to be able to recognize that as a muscle cell. And this is a fascicle, and this is the whole muscle. One of the clues to scale here is that if you could see a nucleus, right here the nucleus is inside a cell, so here the nucleus is pretty big. This is the cytoplasm. This is packed with the myofibrils, the contractile units, which we'll cover. But the nucleus is evident here. Here you can see each one of these tubes right here has a nucleus, or at least a couple of them do that are in plane. Here you can't see the nucleuses at all, right? So when you're trying to figure out scale, am I looking at a muscle or a fiber, right? You can kind of key in on that nucleus, especially when we get to the histology portion, which we'll get into later. So this is kind of covering this learning objective, you know, covering the epimesium, perimesium, fat, all these terms right here, and as well as tendon aponeuroses, which we'll get into. And then now here we're going to talk about the functions of these connective tissue layers. Backtracking a little bit, we have the muscle over here that's going to be composed of the fascicles, which are going to be composed of the cells, which inside those cells are going to have the actual contractile proteins, right? And so when we're talking about muscle contraction as a whole right here, it'll all boil down to this contractile elements within a cell, right? These are the myofibrils within a muscle cell. Right? So this is just back information that'll come up as I talk about these connective tissue layers. But the muscle cell is the thing that's contracting, and it's contracting because the muscle cell itself is packed, jam-packed with thousands of these contractile units here. As far as levels of organization go, you got the myofilaments making up the myofibrils, right? These are the proteins, actin and myosin, the contractile units. They make up these long rods of the myofibrils. They're packed inside the myofiber, the cell. And then the myofibers over here are all arranged into those fascicles, which make up your muscle, right? Levels of organization, right? Protein level, a structural level, cellular level, another structural level, and then your organal level, right? This is more like the tissue level arrangement stuff. So here, as far as the functions, and why I talked about that will become evident soon, but a couple of the functions here are as follows, right? The more obvious one to get out of the way here is that each of these successful layers are separating the individual elements within those layers and from each other, right? So each muscle cell is going to be wrapped in endomesium, And that is going to kind of separate it from the adjacent myofiber, right? So that sometimes these muscle fibers are contracting and this one isn't, right? So you want to kind of protect against friction and damage that'll result from one moving and the other one not moving, right? So that's one thing, it's separating the elements. This perimysium around the fascicle is also separating it from other fascicles, which also may be moving independently of each other. Okay, and so the same thing will be true for the epimysium, because around your muscles there you have muscle compartments. So you have an anterior muscle compartment, and so all the muscles within there are going to be kind of compacted into one big sort of major muscle, and they're all going to be surrounded by your epimysium, right? So all these are isolating each different element from each other, and then also from the other structure levels of organization. The other thing is these muscle cells, even though they're packed with actin and myosin and they have structural proteins, they're a long sort of fragile cell, right? And then when they're very active and they're also, so the collagen in all these dense connective tissue is going to provide a little protection for those, so to protect them against when they're contracting and stretching and all that stuff around here, right? So supporting an otherwise fragile muscle tissue. The other thing, that's the collagen stuff, and there's also a lot of elastic fibers within there, and the type of collagen that's in there is kind of stretchy, so it's providing additional elasticity for when the muscle contracts to bring it back to an extended movement, and when it's stretched out to bring it back into toward resting length, right? So a lot of the elasticity of muscle is due to the connective tissue layers and the elastic fibers within them. So these are three of the functions, a little bit more kind of hard to describe, but those are those. The other ones right here, so let's take a look at this endomysium, right? This is a sort of cool photograph of the endomysium, right? Inside here would be the actual muscle fibers. They're not visible in this picture, but this is the surrounding endomysium. And in truth, it's like kind of like reticular tissue right there, but don't worry, it's fibrous tissue. So, but each one, so here's a muscle fiber, here's a muscle fiber, here's a muscle fiber, here's a muscle fiber, right? You see how they're all separated. If this is kind of a stretchy, strong layer right there, you can see how it's protecting it and kind of stretching along with it, providing a little elasticity. The other thing to note is that these are collagen fibers. There's other fibers in there that are ultimately going to be directly structurally connected to some of the proteins within this muscle fiber. All right, and that'll be important as we want to transmit the force from the contraction of the fiber ultimately to the tendon that's attached to the bone. So all these connective tissue layers eventually are going to combine to form the tendons or the aponeurosis of both ends of the muscle right there. So going back here, your endomysium are all connected with each other, forming this whole big network. And they're all going to be ultimately connected to this perimysium right here. All the perimysium individual fascicles right here are going to be connected with each other within here. And then all those eventually are going to be connected to the epimysium right there. And at the ends over here, all those, right here's the skeletal muscle. They have all those connective tissue layers. They're going to merge over here to form the tendon, right? Which is going to be, they're going to kind of start to form dense, regular connective tissue to form the tendon that will be inserted into the bone. Right? More precisely, the periosteum of the bone, but it's going to be, this is the tendon that's inserted onto the bone, right? So this picture is kind of cool. Here are the muscle fibers. That would be the endomysium and then the perimysium around it. You see how they're kind of merging. And then at this point, you have the actual tendons, right? And you guys know, if you feel like around your anterior side of your wrist or the back of your hand right there, that's like the structure of tendons right there. You can feel the tendons on yourself. They're almost bone-like in their hardness right there. And they're inserting onto the bone. but they gradually form by all those connective tissue layers within the muscle right there to really transmit the force of the contraction here. The muscle cells themselves aren't directly connected to the bone. There's no way for them to transmit the force when they do contract unless you have that connection there. So that's an important point, that combining. And again, what am I going to ask you on a multiple choice or something? Combine to form tendons and aponeurosis, right? But that's what that means when I'm talking about it. And then just as far as those tendons go, the aponeurosis, right, here's this big external oblique or internal obliques. Instead of that, distinct tendon like this, right? Sometimes they form these broad sheets and insert into this broad sheet, but that's the same structure, dense, regular connective tissue right there. But that's what an aponeurosis is. So I want to mention this. This is a red thing, right? So you don't have to listen to this, but it's an interesting kind of concept here, right? Remember this is your individual muscle cell, muscle fiber within these sort of layers of the surrounding endomysium. Inside, here's the muscle fiber, here's the cell membrane of the muscle cell right here. And then inside the cell, you have all the contractile elements that actually shorten and cause that contraction, cause the cell to contract and cause all the fascicles to contract eventually, right? But that force of the contraction is going to be transmitted through these intermediate proteins within the cell and then connected to the cell membrane proteins, which are going to be connected to the basal lamina, which is going to be eventually connected to this tissue right here, to this endomysium, right, to the connective tissue. That's what's going to ultimately transmit that force right here. See this protein right here, it's called dystrophin, right? That's one of the major sort of bridges in between your contractile elements and these structural elements within the membrane right here that are going to transmit that force. When you don't have this protein or it's not working, if it's mutated, then the force of transmission isn't transmitted to here. And when the muscle contracts, there's all sorts of damage to the cell membrane that causes as well, right? Because it's not moving along with the cell membrane. Anybody want to guess what this protein was named after? What disease? Exactly. Muscular dystrophy, right? Dystrophin, they found this was the cause of this mutation, and this caused the disease muscular dystrophy, which is horrible. It's a horrible disease, but one of the first things that happen is that, the people lose a lot of strength. They get a lot of weakness, and a lot of that is due to damage to the cell membrane. You start to get damage here. The cells die. You start to get fibrous buildup around here to repair it. And then eventually your whole muscle decays because of that, right? It says muscular dystrophy, but the reason I'm bringing it up here is about those connections in between your muscles, cells themselves, and the surrounding connective tissue layers. That is its role in combining to form tendons and help transmitting the force. The other thing it does is what any connective tissue layer within an organ does, which is to serve as a route for passage of blood vessels and nerves that are supplying that organ, right? So within, here's your arm, a dissected picture of your arm. They've removed the connective tissue, so all the blood vessels, the stuff we want to see, is visible right here. But normally this is all embedded, right, within the connective tissue layers. So within here, this is within your your muscle right here. You can see these blood vessels penetrating through your epimysium, and then you can see them all through here, penetrating through the perimysium, and then the capillaries will go out and penetrate and reach the individual muscle cells themselves, right? So those blood vessels, as well as the nerves, are going to be running through all that connective tissue to get to the actual cells, right? And this will be true for any organ we look at. This is what the connective tissue function is going to be. One of the major functions of the connective tissue. Serve as sort of that structural framework for blood vessels and nerves to kind of pass through. And then the last thing is that, remember, well, maybe you don't remember, but capillaries, right? Oxygen and nutrients are leaving the capillaries like this. All the arrows right here are pointing to little capillaries. And they're leaving the blood vessels and they're going in within the surrounding connective tissue, right? This is loose connective tissue. It's a kind of aqueous or gel-like substrate that the oxygen and nutrients are diffusing through to actually reach the muscle cells right there, right? So again, that's a major kind of common role of connective tissue. So serves as a route for passage of blood and nerves is the bottom line right there in so many short words. Last thing I want to mention about the role of connective tissue. I kind of mentioned it before. Here's your biceps brachii. Here's your brachialis, right? These are both on the anterior compartment on the front of your humerus right here. And they're forming a flexor compartment. So they're all kind of bundled up together, even though they each have their own individual muscles, their own individual epimysium. There's also this deep fascia right here that's running surrounding them as well as in between them, right? And then you got an extensor compartment on the posterior side, combining the three regions of your triceps. So your deep fascia is another connective tissue role covering these groups of muscle right there. So this is a picture, right? The reason I'm showing this, here, this is an early dissection. And in anatomy, again, connective tissue is kind of like your redheaded stepchild, right? They don't talk about it. They remove it so you could see either the blood vessels or the muscles or whatever, right? But originally covering it is your fascia. So these are some of the important functions of connective tissue. And I've said before, connective tissue is what we dissect to get to the so-called interesting meat. But now you can see that it's an unsung hero and it's an honored guest in my class and on my exams. All right, see you next time.